Okay. Well, good morning, all, and thank you all for being here. I am joined today by Vanita Gupta, head of the department's Civil Rights Division, and Zachary Farden, United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. The Department of Justice is committed to upholding the highest standards of law enforcement throughout the United States. Every American expects and deserves the protection of law enforcement that is effective, that is responsive, that is respectful, and most importantly, constitutional. And each day, thanks to the tireless dedication of men and women who wear the badge, citizens from coast to coast receive just that. But when community members feel that they are not receiving that kind of policing, when they feel ignored, let down, or mistreated by public safety officials, there are profound consequences for the well-being of their communities. There are profound consequences for the rule of law, and for the countless law enforcement officers who strive to fulfill their duties with professionalism and integrity. Today, I'm here to announce that the Department of Justice has opened an investigation into whether the Chicago Police Department has engaged in a pattern or practice of violations of the Constitution or federal law. Specifically, we will examine a number of issues related to the Chicago Police Department's use of force, including its use of deadly force, racial, ethnic, and other disparities in its use of force, and its accountability mechanisms, such as its disciplinary actions and its handling of allegations of misconduct. This investigation has been requested by a number of state and local officials and community leaders, but has been opened only after a preliminary review and careful consideration of how the Justice Department can best use our tools and our resources to meet Chicago's needs. In the coming months, this investigation will be conducted by experienced career attorneys from the Civil Rights Division with the assistance of the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. They will conduct a thorough, impartial, and independent review of the allegations, and the team will meet with a broad cross-section of community members, city officials, and law enforcement command staff and officers to both explain our process and to hear from anyone who wishes to share information relevant to this investigation. We will examine with our experts policies, practices, and data. And at the end of our investigation, we will issue a report of our findings. And if we discover unconstitutional patterns or practices, the Department of Justice will announce them publicly. We will seek a court-enforceable agreement with the Chicago Police Department and work with the city to implement appropriate reforms. Our goal in this investigation, as in all of our pattern or practice investigations, is not to focus on individuals, but to improve systems, to ensure that officers are being provided with the tools that they need, including training, policy guidance, and equipment, to be more effective, to partner with civilians, and to strengthen public safety. And we understand that the same systems that fail community members also fail conscientious officers by creating mistrust between law enforcement and the citizens that we are sworn to serve and protect. This mistrust from members of the community makes it more difficult to gain help with investigations, to encourage the victims and the witnesses of crime to speak up, and to fulfill the most basic responsibilities of public safety officials. And when suspicion and hostility is allowed to fester, it can erupt into unrest. Building trust between law enforcement officers and the communities that we serve is one of my highest priorities as Attorney General. The Department of Justice intends to do everything that we can to foster those bonds and to create safer and fairer communities across the country. And regardless of the ultimate findings of this investigation, we will seek to work with local officials, with residents, and law enforcement officers alike to ensure that the people of Chicago have the world-class police department that they deserve. Thank you so much, and at this time I'm happy to take a few questions.
Should the investigation expand to include the Cook County State's Attorney since so few officers have actually been charged in shootings?
Our investigation is focused on use of force and the accountability within the police department. We'll be looking at how force, including deadly force, is handled, investigated, and how officers are held accountable for that. So that's our focus right now.
Madam Attorney General, could you please tell us, Lynch we cover sometimes, and maybe if U.S. Attorney Farden wants to join in, we're very interested in Chicago and knowing the status of the joint state federal investigation. It's taken quite a while, and would like to know the reaction to the LaQuinn McDonald video document released by the city, if you're aware of them, and the potential of, some people are wondering if you're also going to be looking into a cover-up. So I have two questions there. If you could take them, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. With respect to the investigation into the death of Mr. LaQuinn McDonald, as has been announced earlier, that investigation is ongoing. It is being conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and as with all of our investigations into whether or not there's been a civil rights violation, particularly when there's been a death resulting from police interaction, those investigations are thorough, they are independent, they are impartial. We review the relevant federal statutes, which are, of course, a different set of statutes from what the state's attorney has at their disposal, and we are thorough and efficient in ours. We don't predict the timing of any of those investigations, so I'm not able to give you that particular answer.
And what about the documents that came out that talk about how the police account of what happened is different from what the video showed? Anything to say on that?
What I can tell you is that all of the information will be factored into the federal investigation. We don't comment on the evidence while that investigation is ongoing for obvious reasons, but all of that information is factored into that, and I'm not able to give you any more comments on that at this time. Thanks.
A question, I'm sorry.
Actually, I was curious, obviously Chicago is one of the largest police departments in the country. How does the size affect the ability to find pervasive, sweeping civil rights abuses? Because I imagine when you look into a department with that many officers, you're going to find some bad apples, but you're also going to find plenty of, upstanding good police officers. It's obviously 10 times bigger, or however much times bigger than Ferguson, so I'm just curious, how much that complicates your efforts.
I think it's important to note that when we do a pattern or practice investigation, particularly when we focus on the systems involving use of force, deadly force, and accountability, what we are looking at to see is how does the Chicago Police Department track and treat those types of actions. So a lot of the review that we do is of the systems of the Chicago Police Department. And of course, that will entail a review of how they've handled specific matters. But what we are looking at is to see whether or not the police department, as a systemic matter, has engaged in constitutional violations of policing. This involves a review, as you note, of a host of evidence. Because this case will be worked in conjunction with the Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Northern District of Illinois, we feel confident that we'll be able to cover that. And this gentleman had a question.
Evidence in this case found its way to the Corporation Council in the city of Chicago. Will officials at City Hall be part of this review? And secondly, a question to Mr. Fardin, will you be considering obstruction of justice charges against any police officer who may have been on the scene that night?
With respect to your first question, then I'll turn to Mr. Fardin for the scope of his investigation. With respect to your first question, what we will be looking at again is the Chicago Police Department's method and manner of dealing with use of force, particularly deadly force, and whether or not we find racial, ethnic, and other disparities in how they handle those force allegations. It will encompass a number of things, including how officers are disciplined and the disciplinary systems. We will be working with city officials, but the matters that you're talking about seem to relate to a different issue. What I will say is that we will take information from all interested parties. We are particularly interested in hearing from community groups and community members. We are particularly interested in hearing from the rank and file police department. And obviously we do have contact with City Hall as we do this investigation. But our investigation is independent. It is not tied to either the findings or the actions of other entities. And with respect to your second question, I believe you had a question about the specific McDonald investigation.
Consider obstruction of justice charges, possibly against other officers in the Chicago Police Department.
So at this point in time, we're not predicting what charges, if any, will be brought.
He can't speak.
I will let him speak, but I will tell you that as a general matter, when we have an open investigation, we do not discuss what specific charges may be brought until the resolution of that investigation.
What she said. Thank you, Attorney General. I will only add that I do think it's important, as the Attorney General was explaining, to understand that the pattern and practice investigation that is being launched today, which is very important and positive, I think, for the city of Chicago, is, I do understand,
people that live in the greater Chicagoland region are concerned about that, given recent reports that there are differing versions of what happened out there, and they don't seem to jive, if you will, with what we see on the video.
I completely understand your question. I do think it's important to recognize that today's pattern and practice investigation and the launch of this investigation is related to but separable from what you're asking about, which is the Laquan McDonald incident. And we do not comment on pending investigations other than to reiterate what the Attorney General has already said, which is we do what we do independently. We do it with vigor. We look at all relevant aspects and options as we pursue a case, and it is not unique to this case. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago has a great history of doing that and proving that it is both independent and appropriately aggressive when it comes to ferreting out criminal conduct. But I'm not going to comment on the specifics as to this particular investigation.
Evan, 2, 3, and 5. Evan, and then 2, 3, and 4.
Well, this is a question for both of you, if you will. Part of the criticism of this case has been how long it's taken for any measure of justice to be taken as a result of what happened in that incident. My understanding is that the video, the big piece of evidence, the video was turned over to federal authorities 9 days after it happened. Can you confirm that, and can you tell us, what's taken this long for your investigation?
I'm not going to speak to timelines, specifically what evidence we received and when we received it during the course of the investigation. What I will say is that we have pursued all of the facts and circumstances relevant to Mr. McDonald's death on October 20th, 2014, with vigor, with earnestness, with passion, as we approach any important investigative matter in Chicago.
Thank you. I wanted to ask whether the investigation would also include the extensive allegations of unlawful detention at the Holman Square facility, and if not, why is this not seen as part of the pattern of misconduct investigation?
At this point in time, the investigation is focusing on use of force and the systems within the Chicago Police Department. That's not the issues that you raise are extremely important. They're not at this time within the purview of our investigation. But as we have notified the city, as with every pattern and practice investigation, that we always reserve the right to expand it should more information come to light and require a review of constitutional issues there as well. But at this point in time, it is a use of force investigation. Young lady in front of you.
I have an off-topic question. Yesterday, the president talked about urging Muslim leaders to step up their efforts to stop radicalization in their communities. Can you talk about, is the Justice Department increasing its effort in this area in terms of outreach, or are you changing any other policies or resource allocations in light of the attacks?
Well, with respect to the engagement of the Muslim community in dealing with the issue of homegrown violent extremism and the susceptibility, particularly of young people, to these messages from abroad that encourage them down the path of radicalization, I think the president was appropriately noting that this is a problem for all Americans, and every community has a stake in dealing with this issue, and that where people may be closest to a situation, they have a responsibility as well to try and intervene. We are always reviewing our efforts at countering extremism, not just the Department of Justice, but the Department of Homeland Security. Every United States Attorney's Office is involved in outreach to Arab and Muslim communities, and we're always looking to improve not only our relationship with those communities, but how those communities can be empowered to deal with this issue as well. One of the things that I always talk about when I meet with parents of a variety of communities is to ask them if they know what their children are doing online. And as many of you will doubtless agree, it is very difficult to get a handle on that. And so there's a number of areas in which we think that the Muslim American community can be very effective and proactive in helping resolve these issues. Actually, Sarah's first.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you and perhaps Vanita Gupta about another civil rights investigation. You talked about building trust between communities. Can you tell us what the status is of the Eric Garner investigation, and are you close to closing that with no charges?
Well, what I can tell you is that investigation is also still active and ongoing. It is open, so I'm not able to comment on the specifics of that. And when we come to resolution, we will announce the resolution there. So I'm not able to give you a comment on that case specifically, except to say that it is being conducted by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, an office with which I have some passing familiarity. And that investigation also is independent, it is impartial, it is thorough, and it is reviewing all the relevant issues in that case. And Carrie and then
Just yesterday, on the eve of your news conference this morning, the head of the Illinois Police Review Authority resigned. Obviously, the accountability mechanisms in the state are part of your review process. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is to have a functioning discipline system for police who do fall off the path?
Well, I don't have any comment on the personnel actions that may have been taken with regard to any board at this time. What I can say is that whenever we have an investigation, particularly into use of force and accountability, that the issues of how a police department not only tracks but resolves and disciplines for those uses of force is a key element of that. It's one of the many, many things that we'll be looking at and reviewing. But also, I don't want to make it seem as if we're limited simply to looking at Chicago's systems, because of course we need to hear from community members, from residents who have experienced situations where they may feel that the use of force was not dealt with appropriately. And so we compare those to how it's handled internally. The investigation covers a host of issues. So I don't want to make it seem as if we're looking only at Chicago's systems, because it's very, very important that we hear also from community members. It's also important that we hear from rank and file police officers about their perceptions of their training, their perceptions of how use of force is handled from their perspective as well.
A question, please, for Vanita Gupta. Based on your experience, your now long experience with these kinds of investigations, what would you expect the timeline to be? Are we in Chicago? Are we talking months or years?
Speak to that.
Sure. So as you know, probably that we are unable to give any specific timeline. All we are able to say is that the department will be conducting this review in a very thorough manner and will not leave any stone unturned. And we look forward to working with everyone who has a stake in the Chicago Police Department.
Madam Attorney General, as a sort of follow-up to that, with a department that's as big as Eric was saying, how far back does a review like this look? You know, is it 3 years, 10 years? How do you determine whether a police department as big as Chicago has a pattern or practice of discrimination?
Well, you know, it's hard to say at this point how far back we'll go, simply because we have yet to begin. But we look at, for example, civilian complaints. We look at trends in civilian complaints. We look at trends in accountability and trends in discipline. And so we may start with one perspective, and it could very easily expand into a longer time frame. So at this point, I'm not going to cabin the time period of the review of the procedures and things that have been occurred. This gentleman's not asked it.
Just follow up on that, and then I got another question. The follow is, I think in the Cleveland police investigation, it went for 21 months. That would obviously take it past the tenure of political appointees under this administration. Are you confident that the Chicago pattern and practice review will be completed on your tenure? And then my main question is about the terrorism investigation. You mentioned in your interview on NBC that you were not sure what ideology motivated this attack. But then we have the president give a big Oval Office address talking about how we're going to step up our fight against ISIL and talking about this attack in some detail. How should I reconcile those two things? Are you now confident that this did have something to do with ISIL, whether or not it was directed by them?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to go in reverse order to deal with that issue, and then your question regarding the timeline of the investigation. At this point, we are discussing the San Bernardino investigation because we want the public to be aware of how these investigations are conducted, of their complexity, and the fact that they are, in fact, a marathon and not a sprint. And so we're trying to keep people informed while also maintain the integrity of investigative techniques and the like. So you do have us talking about this investigation more than we can talk about others. For example, as you see from the questions here today. At this point, we're not prepared to say we're not prepared to limit any particular ideology to what may have inspired these individuals. There are a number of groups that are on social media looking to encourage people to commit acts of violence within the homeland. And so at this point, we simply do not want to rule anything out. The president was talking about, however, the specter of ISIS, which is an evolving threat against American interests here and abroad, and our campaign to defeat ISIS, but also other terrorist groups that seek to harm American interests here and abroad. And with respect to your question about the timing, again, we can't give you any prediction on this. It is my view that these investigations are significant, they are important, and we feel that they will be carried out because, frankly, it's in the interest of the people of the city of Chicago who deserve a world-class police department and who deserve constitutional policing. And this lady.
With Reuters, I was wondering why the department did not open an investigation into the Chicago Police Department before the Illinois Attorney General called for it, given the volume of complaints against the department, and for how long the Justice Department was aware of the videos of Mr. McDonald's shooting death and the others, Ronald Johnson, Cedric Chapman, that are due to come out.
So I'm not, as the U.S. Attorney has indicated, we're not going to comment on the timeline of evidence that comes in and our review of that. What I can say is that we did receive requests from a number of people and offices to look at the Chicago Police Department, and we considered those requests. We also considered what we saw of the Chicago Police Department also, and so a combination of factors. A review by the career people in the Civil Rights Division has led us to come to this conclusion that this particular pattern and practice investigation is necessary.
I don't know that anyone could have really predicted the sheer number of cases, shooting-related and police investigations that you've been asked to undertake, not only here, obviously, but Ferguson, South Carolina, Garner, Cleveland, et cetera, et cetera. Is the Department of the Civil Rights Division prepared in terms of funding and staffing and statutory authority to deal with these, or do you worry that the system is just going to become overwhelmed by all these investigations?
Well, I will tell you that I'll always take additional resources should Congress seek to allocate them to me. We're confident that with the strong team that we are building with the Civil Rights Division in the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Illinois, that this case will be well staffed. And also in other cases, we work very, very closely with our local U.S. Attorney's offices on these matters. And often they are the ones who bring them to our attention and work as we see on the underlying criminal cases.
I have a follow-up to what he said. It'd be quick. Just, do you have an idea of how many people then you're deployed? And to analyze all this vast amount of data, do you bring in like outside contractors and academics to help sift through this?
So I won't comment on the size of the investigative team because that changes over time as we see the issues. What I can tell you is that in these cases we do rely upon police experts and people who are statisticians. But in this instance, we're not predicting the number of those individuals who would be involved because, again, it may change the more we get into the matter.
You mentioned sort of briefly a preliminary review that was done. Can you sort of elaborate on what it was specifically that you were told during this preliminary review to make you think that there must be sort of systemic problems that are worth the Justice Department looking into? What kinds of problems did you hear?
No, but nice try. No, we don't go into that. But what I will say is that we did review the requests. We reviewed what we saw of the Chicago Police Department and felt that this investigation was appropriate and this was the time to open the investigation. And this is John back and then Paul.
So talking about the number of investigations that are taking place, they're all reactionary to specific instances, some which have even led to civil unrest. But what can the department do beforehand to try to prevent things like this from happening in the first place?
Well, what I would say is that all of the pattern and practice investigations are not totally reactionary in terms of specific cases. We often have situations where police departments reach out to us and request assistance in terms of training and collaborative reform. For example, in the Baltimore situation, that was an ongoing situation, and after working with the Baltimore Police Department, we felt that a pattern and practice investigation was required in that matter. So that was one where it had come about as a result of a different type of process. So when we are talking with the police department, we are looking to see the depth of the issues, whether or not the constitutional issues are implicated. That is the impetus for a pattern of practice investigation. And then Paula, and then
This administration has been so aggressive about opening civil rights cases, but as you said, you have a limited number of resources. I think the hope was that some police departments would see these high-profile cases, maybe take a hint, or try to take care of their problems on their own. But even a couple days ago, I mean, the mayor of Chicago didn't quite get it. Do you think that these high-profile investigations are sending a message? Do you think that police departments across the country get it in terms of excessive use of force and racial bias policing?
What I will say is that in my discussions with police officers across the country, both the command and the rank and file, they look very carefully at the Department of Justice actions. And many of them do try and look at our consent decrees and look at the issues that spurred a pattern of practice investigation and try and implement issues or changes to avoid getting into that situation. And that, of course, is our hope. That, of course, is what we hope for. We hope that the reports, which are all on our website, I know that you all have read them intensely, but we hope that these reports do talk about situations in which police departments find themselves possibly having violated the Constitution. It is our view that police departments will and should look at those reports and take actions before it arises to the level of either a specific case or an incident involving a civilian and a law enforcement officer, or the department having to take action.
Last question.
When did your preliminary investigation begin? Did it begin before the call by the State Attorney General? Did it begin before the public release of the video?
I'm not going to comment on the timing of that. And then behind you, the gentleman had his hand up also.
As recently as last week, the mayor of Chicago didn't want the Justice Department involved in the city. He's since relented. But how confident are you that you're going to get the cooperation of the city that you need?
Well, we go into these investigations in every city hoping that we will receive the cooperation of the city. And in a situation where we would not, we would engage with them and let them know what we needed and why it's important. So we are going into this investigation with the view that we will get the cooperation of not only the city, but as I mentioned, also the community. It's very, very important to us to hear from community members about these types of interactions.
Last week at the Muslim Advocates Dinner, you had commented on DOJ vigorously working toward protecting any, those in the Muslim community and any anti-Muslim rhetoric that might come out of the attack that just occurred in San Bernardino. Can you elaborate on that and any types of measures DOJ is undertaking at the moment to kind of look at the red flags of that?
Well, what I will say is that, as of course we prosecute deeds and not words, but we always have a concern when we see rhetoric rising against any particular group in America, that it might inspire others to violent action, and that violent action is what we would have to deal with. At this point, I think I would refer to how the President dealt with it last night, which is, as we consider the ways in which we keep American interests safe here and abroad, not to give in to fear and not to let fear make us abandon our values. So what we're focused on, obviously, is protecting all of the people under the ambit of the Department of Justice. And our concerns are that the understandable fears that are out there after San Bernardino not lead people to either take the law into their own hands or to take actions that are not going to be justified.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.